episode 30 of the Bible Connection podcast. Can you believe we're on 30?
That's crazy for me.
Was that like 22 left? Is the math check?
I don't know if we'll have the same number of episodes as weeks.
Oh.
So no, but
66?
let's hope not.
We had a couple.
The Jedi won't like that.
Well, anyways, so guys, this is a weekly podcast. That's why I got that 52 number. That follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. So I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are a couple of my good friends, Taylor Babcock.
Hello.
Brandon Stooksbury.
Howdy.
And John Steinke.
You're there.
So guys, this week we are discussing the book of Ecclesiastes. So far, each book of the Bible we've looked at has had a title that kind of makes sense. Like Ruth has a person named Ruth in the story. Samuel has a person named Samuel in the story. Chronicles was a collection of historical chronicles. What I want to know is what does Ecclesiastes mean, and why is it called that?
Well, Ecclesiastes actually comes from the Greek title that we had for the text here in the Old Testament. So we're going to talk about this here in a few weeks. We still plan on doing an episode on what happened between the Old and the New Testament. But sometime between the Old and the New Testament, everyone in ancient Israel was forced to learn to speak Greek, right? So here we have a Greek title that's kind of carried into from the word ecclesia, which means the assembly. We use that in the New Testament when we refer to to the church. But that's the title that we have because the Hebrew title was kind of from this word we get in the first verse of Ecclesiastes, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, that word preacher is kind of like the best effort here in my ESV to kind of present what that Hebrew word kohelet is, which is more like the assembler, the guy assembling the congregation, which is why the Greek title, the assembly or the ecclesia. So the title Ecclesiastes is addressing basically the format that the text is given in, which is a preacher or an assembler who's gathered the congregation before him in order to teach about the wisdom of God. And so I personally think this is Solomon. I look at verse 12, and I don't really see another clear way to interpret a different author when it says, I, the preacher who's been king over Israel in Jerusalem. And when you couple that with the first verse that calls him a son of David, there is no other person that it could possibly be that is son of David and king over all of Israel in Jerusalem. Because if you remember to Kings, after Solomon, the kingdom divided, and there were no kings over Israel in Jerusalem. So that's my perspective.
Does verse 16 play into that too, where it says his wisdom was surpassing all who were over Jerusalem?
Yeah, that would definitely
help
apply.
Concrete that, yeah.
Yeah, so there are different perspectives on this. I'm not going to say you have to think that means it was necessarily exactly the person Solomon. I just think that I don't find those other arguments very convincing.
Gotcha.
I think that just the plain reading of that kind of emphasizes it was Solomon to me. So here we have Solomon, king over Israel, assembling the congregation like he did in 1 Kings chapter 8, but this time to address a serious question and a serious kind of concern about why should you follow the wisdom of God.
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to mention, that the context definitely seems to fit a 1 Kings 8, where Solomon is in the prayer of dedication in this section as he's dedicating the temple. So.
All right, so over and over again throughout the whole book of Ecclesiastes, the word vanity and the phrase under the sun are used. So what I want to know is what do these words / phrases mean, and why are they used so much? I think vanity is used like 38 times or something like that. 29.
So
I'm sorry, I'm wrong. I was looking at another phrase.
We all just kind of did like the Spider-Man meme where we pointed at each other, seeing who wants to take this one.
That happens a lot.
I should edit that in the podcast.
we don't really want to say with too much confidence that we know for certain exactly what this means. So we know it doesn't mean like ocean or something random. Like havel is the Hebrew word for vanity, and it's interpreted as like smoke or a breath or a vapor in the wind. See that song, all we are is dust in the wind. It's talking about something that is that how the song goes?
I have no idea what song you're talking about.
Kansas, dude. Dust in the wind.
Okay, he knows.
What? Am I too young for this song?
Maybe.
Yes.
It's like the 70s, I think.
It has
Also way
something
too
to do
young.
with how temporary it is. It's like it's not meaningful enough to last, but sometimes the word meaningful might not be the right word. So anybody else want to chime in here? What you've been studying about what Havel means?
And I think one of the reasons why we all looked at each other is because I don't think we're all certain on it, but we have at least somewhat of an idea of kind of the essence of it. I think temporary is a word that kind of fits in it, that breath that it's momentarily there, but then it's gone. There's some people who kind of hold to where it could be like a fogginess or unclearness. It's once again before you, but you don't have absolute certainty what it is before you that you're trying to understand.
I was listening to this one rabbi who described it as like a rabbi, not because I care about his interpretation over Christian scholarship, but because he knows his Hebrew. He was like, it's like a smoke. Like it looks like, it's got a form, but if you try to reach out and grab it, it just slips right through your fingers. Like it's elusive kind of thing.
Yeah, and that I like that because I think so much of what is being communicated oftentimes in the Hebrew scriptures has like this image of it. So like I'm just imagining someone reaching out and grabbing something that they can't hold on to. So I think whichever route you take, I think a few of those kind of put together, understanding the essence of what is being communicated through this book can kind of be wrapped up in a few of those. So
yeah, like because over 30 times this phrase vanity is used.
38, I was right.
What? I said over 30.
Yeah.
We're both right. Okay. Well, over.
Make sure
I
that's
was
known.
clearly wrong.
So over 30 times this phrase is used. Vanity, vanity of vanities, everything's vanity, and like trying to work out what that means is important because the problem being addressed in this text is the very serious question of, okay, we talked about Proverbs last week. Why should you follow the wisdom of God? Well, last week, the perspective from Proverbs was like a loving father saying, do you have any love for mom and dad? Do it because we ask you to. Mm-hmm. Like this is what's important to us. It's going to be good for you. This is taking a different perspective. It's more of the perspective of the person who's approaching more skeptically. Why would I follow the law of God when I've seen the people who take bribes prosper and the people who, like Job, do everything right, their whole family is killed in a single day? Why would I follow God's law? And it's addressing it intellectually in a serious way. It's not going to take cheap shots. It's not going to kind of ignore the depth and the weight of that argument. He's going to address the vanity, the havel, the fleetingness of the good things in life, how everything can just be so temporary and just in a moment it could all be gone. And he's going to address that. And so this other phrase, under the sun, do you guys want to talk what that is?
Well, yeah, kind of right in between what you're saying. One thing that we can notice in the book of Ecclesiastes is how God, how he is referred to, right? So as we've been looking through the wisdom literature, well, as we were in the Torah, and then we've gotten into the wisdom literature here, we've noticed that God reveals himself. He's called Yahweh, right? And you'll see that as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D in your English translations of the Old Testament. This is just in the Old Testament. But where you see the word God with a capital G, that's Elohim, right? So in Ecclesiastes, you will not find Lord, capital O, capital R, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. You will not find Yahweh in Ecclesiastes, but it's interesting that it's always Elohim. And I was listening, I don't remember who it was I was listening to, but they made a good point that as God's covenant name is not revealed, is not given in this book, it's definitely it's drastically different than what's come before in Proverbs and what's to come after in Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. And so we see that there's at least something different going on here. And so some have argued that this is definitely showing that Ecclesiastes and this life under the sun is life in a Genesis 3 post-fall world, right? And we don't in this post-fall world where we're exiled from the garden, right? We're out. This is taking, putting ourselves in a worldview that's outside outside of God's covenant, how he's revealed himself covenantally, right? Because when we are in covenant with Yahweh, we're in a covenant of hesed and emet, right? Faithfulness and loyal love, right? That's but the Ecclesiastes is starkly different. So that ties into what you were just
so
saying.
with under the sun, then you went.
Well, I'll say that Genesis 3 imagery of exiled from the garden, exiled from God's presence. And when we see everything on earth that we see, it is life without God's presence among us. So when we see that, it's really a disconnect from the way that God designed everything to work, and then really our human establishment of the way we have ordered the world to work. And it's really this human this human way of living that everything goes about is really communicated as under the sun.
Yeah, I agree. What comes to my mind, I was talking with some of the college kids recently about, like, how do you talk about your faith with a person who's skeptical towards it and is like, tell me why you believe in God, but I don't want to hear about these miracles. Tell me about just from nature, so what I can see, that empirical evidence kind of thing. And I think that the assembler, the preacher, is speaking to that kind of person. He's going to say, okay, let's talk about the world under the sun, and I'll still address to you why following the wisdom of God is valuable in the end.
And this might tangent just a little bit off of that, but we look at, so for that same question, describe the world without miracles and all that. I would say the world operating without the miracles that we see of God is the unnatural way.
Yes.
Whereas
I agree.
when God is performing his miracles, Jesus walking on water, we see those, that is the natural way. We're just so ingrained in the fallenness of how the world is operating, we don't realize the way it actually is supposed to operate.
I agree.
Yeah, and picking up on the wisdom, I wasn't here for. I missed you guys talking about.
Could have used you. I mean, I've been so uncomfortable through all of these wisdom episodes. Like, I'm still in my 20s here, and I'm supposed to be describing like these texts that are trying to raise up wisdom for young man. I mean, I'm gonna be way more comfortable when we get to the prophets, and I can just lean on like the value I can add historically to things, because I've been like praying like I don't know what I'm saying. Anyway, what were you saying?
He's much more comfortable with you, Brandon.
Oh, with all three of us are together.
It must be my gray hairs. So Proverbs would tell us in the answer: don't answer a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him. But then you'll see the next verse. It says, "But answer a fool according to his folly." And you're thinking, "What in the world? That's a contradiction." But it's not. It's showing that with a Christian worldview, and Greg Bonson was a master of talking about this, and he's one of my heroes. But within the Christian worldview, within the covenant, within God's covenant, right? We don't answer fools, according, like when in certain unethical and completely immoral arguments. We never step inside. We never step inside a unbeliever's world, outside of Christ's worldview, in order to reason with them in that way. But at the same time, we can step in to that. Don't answer a fool according to his folly, right? Lest you be like him. But then in another way, in a completely different way, answer the fool according to his folly. And you're thinking, wait a minute, how's that not a contradiction? When you step into the unbeliever's worldview, when someone who has a worldview that's outside of God's covenant relationship, you step into that worldview to show how irrational it is, right? You step into, okay, and you would say, okay, this is what you believe. Let's trace the logic in what you're saying to its end, to its conclusion, and it's foolishness. And that's what you do. You step into that worldview to show that it's foolish. You never borrow that worldview, but you step into it to show. It's like Doug Wilson calls it a demolition derby of worldviews, right? You go in there and you crash into them until one's left running, right? And it's the Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. So
I would also just encourage people, like, when you're talking with somebody, you need to make sure that you're not trying to get gotcha points if you're really trying to convince somebody.
And that's hard.
Of the holes.
And I'll be the first to admit that is really hard not to want to stroke your ego and be like.
I think one of my favorites, and I'll listen to some debates online before, and I can't remember who was this famous debate. It's a really famous debate about, like, the great debate, does God exist? He was talking to some atheists, and he said, like, do you believe in immaterial laws of logic? And he said, yes.
That was Greg Bonson and Gordon Stein.
He's like, do you believe in immaterial laws of logic? He said, yes. And then later in the debate, he set that up because he knew he was going to ask him, like, is God material or immaterial? He's like, immaterial. And he's like, can you give me an example of anything that's immaterial? He's like, yes, the laws of logic. And like, it just like as a mic drop. Yeah. It did not win his heart. It did not do any help in convincing him. It felt like he was trying to get cheap points. Now, I'll be fair, in that argument, he was probably more concerned about the audience than the person he was debating. But I'm just going to encourage people, as you step in to address these worldviews, I think that what the author, the Kohelet, the assembler of Ecclesiastes is doing is more gently really addressing each of the serious concerns with the skepticism of following God's wisdom and leading them through how God's wisdom stands out in the end.
Let me push back on you for just a second.
Okay.
Because I think we're on the same page, but as when you're reading the book of Acts, right? Apollos greatly it says that he debated the Jews publicly, right? And basically refuting them. But the Acts tells us, it says, but those who were there were greatly helped by
I completely agree.
Yeah.
You need to know what's your goal. Is your goal that the hundreds around you that are vulnerable to pernicious lies might be hearing, and your goal is to make sure that they're being convinced, or is your goal the person you're debating? Because Jesus wasn't ineffective, and he argued with the Pharisees. Was Jesus just a bad debater? No, his goal wasn't the Pharisees. If his goal was the Pharisees, he would have spoke a little differently than calling them snakes every time they walked up. His goal was the people around and the thousands of generations in the future that would discern against false teaching. So you just got to be careful about who you're talking to and what's your goal in these conversations.
Trying not to take this on a tangent, but it reminds me of a conversation. Because when I was reading Ecclesiastes, I was thinking, like, this is philosophy that we're still dealing with today. Mm-hmm. People are
nihilism,
trying to figure out what's the meaning of life. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And luckily, us as Christians, we don't have to worry about those kind of things. But anyways, he told me, this is a good friend of mine, he said, there's no such thing as a truth statement, an absolute truth. And it's like,
which is a truth statement.
Which is a truth statement. You know what I mean? I think that's like the essence of what you're trying to say, right, Brandon? Yeah. Like, if you truly boil things down to the minutia, to the end of your question, you're going to figure out, like, we don't know what we're talking about.
Well, let's do that with Ecclesiastes.
Let's do it. Okay. So we talked about vanity under the sun. So often the book of Ecclesiastes is grouped with other books in the Bible, and we call them wisdom literature. So what is the wisdom or message we are supposed to take away from this book?
It's heavy. It's not the the positive, encouraging K-Love book of the Bible. It starts off with life is meaningless.
30 seconds of hope.
Good people die young, and the wicked laugh at it. Every building you'll ever build will crumble. Every party you ever throw will end. Everything you ever learn will be forgotten, and everyone dies. However,
nobody remember your name.
However, right worship is eternally meaningful. The humble life of wisdom, though it will be forgotten, does good. God sees you, so living a life of humility and trust before your Creator is your duty. And so he addresses the painful, dark elements of life with the timeless truth of God's wisdom. That's kind of the overall theme, and it's broken down in this inclusio, which is a kind of a literary technique. What does that mean? At the beginning, chapter 1, verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And it's repeated at the end of the text in chapter 12, verse 8, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. And in a literary context, it's kind of spoken from the first person inside of that inclusio. And when you get to the end, in those last few verses, it goes to the third person again, where kind of in a narrator perspective, he gets the final word and kind of explains the truth of it all. And so the ultimate conclusion to all of these, when we say vanity, let's go back to what that word means. It feels random. It feels so temporary. Everything's fleeting is a good word, right? The end result of all of this is still the conclusion that we are to... Where's the verse? Chapter 12, verse 13. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So that's kind of the message or the wisdom that I've taken from it. Do you guys have anything else to add?
Well, yeah, you see, for instance, the last few verses of chapter 2. There's nothing better for a person than that he should eat, drink, and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, and apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the busyness of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. I think that Paul is picking up on this in 1 Corinthians 15. One, because in verses 14 and then also in verse 17, the word vanity or vapor or whatever we want to, however we want to translate it, different translations do different things with this. But we must remember, we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, after Alexander the Great and the Hellenization of the world,
which means being Greekified.
Yes,
making you Greek.
Yes,
Greekified.
That's the reason that our New Testaments were originally probably mostly written in Greek, is because that was the language of the world at that time. But the Old Testament was translated into Greek, and that is called the Septuagint or the Septuagint. If you look at your footnotes, sometimes you'll see an LXX. That's what that means. It's literally 70. It means the Septuagint. And the Septuagint translates this Greek or this Hebrew word here as vanity. Paul picks up on this in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 14 and 17. It's vain in verse 14 and it's futile in verse 17. But then also at the on down into verse in 1 Corinthians 15, if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, verse 32, and what do I gain in humility and speaking? I fought with beasts in Ephesus. If the dead are not raised, let us eat or drink, and tomorrow we die. Well, he goes on to say, whether you eat or drink, do all for the glory of God. I think that's also Colossians. But I think he's picking up on this logic of Ecclesiastes. So.
To tag on to that, I think we were all created for a purpose. Man was designed to worship God and to be an image bearer of him. So when you read chapter 12 and it says, fear God and keep his commandments, this is the whole duty of man, that is us fulfilling our role. But then when we look out and we see everyone in the busyness of gathering, collecting, and pursuing all of these worldly things that are under the sun that have no meaning, that when you look at life, it's short, you're going to die, no one's going to remember you. All of these things that you pursue amount to nothing. It's because man is not fulfilling the role in which they were designed. And when we go outside of our purpose in which God created us to be, it's futile. And I think that is described in detail throughout Ecclesiastes, but then we see it summarized: fear God and keep his commandments, fulfill your role, fulfill your purpose in what God has designed and called us to do.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of one of my favorite books I've ever read, The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis, where he's talking about that purpose that we have in us if we could just have, the right perspective, if we could see how things really are. He talks about how empty it is for every worldly perspective that tries to criticize, the worldview of Christ while trying to find meaning in their own little mud pies, right? And And he's like, as if anything could ever overcome the salinity of the universe and the heat death of the second law of thermodynamics. Nothing can. Everything is going to fade. You may say, like, as Taylor was talking, what do you mean nobody's going to remember me? People can remember me. I don't know my great-grandfather's name, right? And I study genealogies. So,
might study harder.
But what he says at the conclusion of it was, you've never met a mere mortal. Everyone you've ever met is immortal, to one degree or to the other, immortal. Every tree you've ever seen will fade. Every rock you've ever touched will disintegrate. Every star you ever see with this James Webb telescope will fade into brown dwarfs. But every person you've ever met will either be an angelic being so beautiful in Christ that you'd be tempted to worship them, or a creature so wretched they would fill your darkest nightmares. And every action you take is having some degree of bringing them to one of those two destinations. And so we should recognize, as we look at the fleetingness of life, that we don't live under the sun, that we do have a purpose. We were created by God to fill the earth with his glory, and we should fear God and keep his commandments.
One of my favorite things to do is to look at the sky at night and to see the stars. And looking at the stars, for me, gives me perspective on the grandness and how big the universe is. And when looking at that vantage point puts in perspective and shows for me how little I am and how futile I am without God. And as big as the universe is, and such a relatively small blip on the timeline of everything, my life is that if I don't live it for God, it really is just a blip that will carry away and mean nothing. For how big the universe is, we're but a speck. For how long the universe has been around, we're but a speck. So if we pursue the worldly things, we're wasting our speck of time on meaningless things.
And Brandon pointed out to me just a second ago, I think some of that quote that I was mixing quotes, some of it was from Mere Christianity too. So I'd encourage you to read both of those texts. They're kind of great reads.
All right, so this whole text is unfolding of an argument based on the question in the introduction. So we got what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun, right? So to which we receive the conclusion in chapter 12. So what do we do with all the arguments in between? Are they all just flawed arguments? And should we ignore compared to the conclusion?
I think you need to be careful. Don't take Ecclesiastes on its own, because the rest of the scriptures will tell us that work is good. God created us to work, right? And God created us to work hard and be fruitful in the things that we do.
Ecclesiastes says that too, right?
Well, what I'm saying is don't find ourselves in that worldview that. But
I'm tracking.
Let's take all of Ecclesiastes in tandem with all of the scriptures.
I'm tracking.
Yeah. Because
like don't throw the towel in and do nothing and sit on your butt the rest of your
life. Yeah. If you just take certain passages, it can throw you off, and not because you may be seeing that passage from the wrong worldview. You need to see that the scriptures, the work is good, right? Wine is good, food is good, right?
Food is really good.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So don't be thrown off by those. Some I think some have taken those passages and kind of applied it to like a teetotaler. I may step on some toes here, but whatever.
I don't know what you mean by teetotaler.
I'm not going any further than that.
I think my answer to that would be, you are definitely seeing the right structure of the text if you take the end and say, we need to look at chapter 12 after verse 8, and this is the conclusion. This is the final word on the matter. But you're going way too far to dismiss the idea that there's wisdom to be gained throughout the whole book. Right. Yes, he's addressing an argument apart from God, under the sun. And yes, he's addressing a skeptic who doesn't believe in the law. But he's, throughout the addressing those things, he's infusing Torah, wisdom, instruction right into the heart of the text. So he doesn't, waste 11 chapters and just say what he really could have said all along at the very end. He's walking through this, fleeting vanity that he sees in the world, and he's giving the wisdom that he's gathered. So some places I could point out to you where you can see some things that you can grow from in the middle of this text, not just at the beginning and the end. I would point at chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, where he is talking about, all of this stuff before was, fleeting, but your worship is eternally meaningful. And in chapter 9, verses 13 through 18, even if your work will be forgotten, to be a humble and wise person that helps your community is meaningful. And ultimately, in chapter 11, even if you can't understand where things come from, like the bones of a baby being formed in the womb and the circumstances of your youth, even if you can't track what's going on, God's in control and there's meaning. And so he's not just waiting to the conclusion. This whole text has truth that we can learn from.
Well, do you think that the arguments in between also have conclusions in between? Like, for instance, trying to gather my notes here. Like, for instance, the problem in chapter 5, where the vanity of wealth and honor, right? And then
no is my simple answer. I don't think I do think he's kind of addressing each one, but I think he's saving his ultimate conclusion for the end.
Or like when Brandon mentioned 1 verse 24, like, is that not an answer to 1 through 2:23? Excuse me, chapter 2, verse 24. There's nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink, enjoyment in his toil, from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? Right? This idea, like, he's extrapolating, like, apart from God, like, of course all things are vanity. Like, he's kind of answering. I mean, do you agree that he's kind of answering what they're talking about prior?
I think that he's addressing each argument as he goes, but he's kind of building it up to a big conclusion in the end.
Right. Okay. Cool. All right. I think that draws us to a close. So I reckon just remember that you need to fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man, right? So, in closing, that brings to the end of this week's episode of the Bible Connection podcast. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who took the time to listen this week. We hope this podcast equips and encourages you as you read. Leave a comment on YouTube if you have any questions, or you can send us an email with the question or with a question to the email on screen. I hope you have a blessed day, and we'll be back with episode 31.